Thank you, Kate.
Yeah. All right. Well, happy Peer Review Week, everyone. This is a week that is widely recognized within the world of academic publishing and research services. But this year, we wanted to prepare a webinar tailored to help researchers understand the best practices when engaging in peer review. So today, you will hear from 3 expert guest speakers. You will hear from Judy Milka, the founder of Scientifyresearch, Gareth Dyke, the academic director at ReviewerCredits, and you will hear from Shivendra Naidu, the senior engagement lead at Orchid. And now I'd like to turn it over to Judy Milka, founder of Scientifyresearch and former immunology researcher turned academic publishing professional with years of experience in peer review, to open today's webinar and share more about how we at Scientifyresearch can empower researchers. Judy.
Thank you, Kate. And again, I'm so happy to have you here with us today. It is such a privilege also to share the stage with Gareth and Shivendra. So, you know, at Scientifyresearch, and I think this is our homepage, and I think many of you have seen it. Our motto is, as you see, we connect you with research funding information. And at the heart of all this is that, you know, it is in our vested interest to invest in your career, in your career success, because ultimately, by you having that information, would enable the best research funding decisions. And when we can empower researchers and to have the best funding decisions, we also have the solutions that we need to advance us as a society. So thank you again for the amazing work that you do. And would like to share with you today how we can enable and empower you as a researcher to be even more successful in your research journey. So I'm a person that when I'm faced with a challenge or a question, I like to go back to first principles. And so when it comes to first principles of the research career, I think many of you, this is a no-brainer for you, right? So, you know, your career starts with a job, finding a job, and that's also very closely linked with your research funding. So whether it's a PhD that you're starting or you are a seasoned researcher, so your job and funding is very much tied together, and this enables you to do research. And when you do your research, then of course you want to disseminate that information and share it with the community and also worldwide. So you want to publish those results. And this then of course leads into research assessment and your career success. And you know, this week I was just in Manchester, also at another conference, at VTech conference, and there I really learned so much about how the research, the assessment and the research culture is changing. Namely, research assessment is really also moving towards looking at research culture, which I see this as a very positive advancement in the way things are changing. Another cornerstone in research, of course, is that forms the crux of research assessment is peer review. And in the peer review, so today Gareth will talk to you about the publishing side, so in the journal publishing side of peer review. But a lot of the things that he will tell you, of course, will also relate to the funding side. That also, because at the end of the day, it is your peers that are assessing your applications. So since I have your attention and talking about your research career success, I'd like to address some of the myths and facts when it comes to research funding. So when it comes to research funding, and you know, as Scientifyresearch, you know, we love to listen to your stories about how your research career, your workflows, and Kate has been speaking with many of you, and from those conversations, these are some of the topics that we come across quite frequently. And so sometimes when we speak with researchers, some are very adamant that you know all your research funders. And also, there's also a misconception that, you know, your national funder are the only ones that would fund your research. Many people use Google as a way to find research funding information. there's also a group that think that or commonly practice, just relying on others to tell them about research funding opportunities. And then once you know the opportunity, there's in terms of deciding whether to apply, there's also a group out there think that, if it's really competitive, they won't apply. Or sometimes even before people even looking into how competitive it is, they already think, oh, maybe I'm not eligible. Now, all these are, just facts. These are how people perceive the reality of research funding. And it is, of course, our passion is research. And so, we need to also have evidence-based knowledge, right? So evidence-based knowledge to what we are saying, to support what we're saying. So, when it comes to knowing all your funders, we would argue that actually it's quite difficult to know them all, because at least according to Crossref, there are more than 30,000 research funders out there. So it will be hard to imagine that you would have the opportunity to easily see how these could be eligible, how you could be eligible for these research funders. So I would like to encourage you to broaden your horizons. And when it comes to broadening your horizons, at least when it comes to research funders, your national funder, of course, is your main go-to place when it comes to research funding. But in fact, there are many funders actually beyond that would fund you. So, so funders fund beyond their borders. And I guess a very obvious one is the National Institute of Health that is a huge biomedical funder in the US. It is the biggest biomedical funder in the world, I believe, mainly for the USA, but, they have a lot of opportunities also open for researchers worldwide. Another one, of course, is the Wellcome Trust, also funds very wide range of countries in addition to the UK. And when it comes to using Google, keep in mind that Google is not a research funding database. So you may find funding opportunities, but you will still have to spend that time and energy to look through every single call to see whether you're eligible. So it may not be the most effective way to find research funding. Okay, and then when it comes to word of mouth, now networking is great. It's really a great place to find information, but it's also a little bit of a passive way because you're waiting for others to tell you. So maybe if you would like to be proactive, we highly recommend to expand beyond that. Now, when it comes to low success rate, really think about why. This is when it comes down to really understanding the funding call. Investing that time to understand what exactly that they are looking for before you even apply. And so sometimes, yes, it's correct not to apply, but first try to understand what the funders are looking for. And finally, really don't self-select yourself out of opportunities, right? If you self-select, then there's no chance at all. So keep that in mind. And, now back to the culture and research assessment, we know there's hyper competition in research funding. But we would argue that part of the problem is actually that, this distribution of the information. So a lot of the time people focus on all the famous funders. So like the stones here, so everybody is focusing on these. And then, of course, there's a hyper competition there. And so we would like to help you discover other funding and from other funders so that you can distribute your efforts and diversify your funding portfolio. And so we are vested in your research success. And so now we have told you about how to find more relevant funding, why it's important. And then, of course, Gareth will tell you about peer review. And also we're very pleased that Shubhendra from ORCID will tell you about ORCID and how ORCID can facilitate your research career success. So now over to Gareth.
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce our first invited guest speaker today, Gareth Dyke. Gareth is traveling today and he's actually having trouble connecting, but Gareth is a genius and he sent us a recording of his presentation as a backup, which Judy will now share. So Gareth currently works as the academic director at ReviewerCredits. He worked for many years as a paleontology researcher at universities in Ireland and the UK, and he's published more than 350 peer-reviewed journal articles. Gareth is the editor-in-chief of the Taylor and Francis Paleobiology Journal, Historical Biology, And Gareth continues to review for journals in his field on a regular basis, but he also creates content and training to help other researchers. So now, Judy, I'd like to ask you if you're able to share. If not, I can see what I can do. Oh, there he is.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to do this presentation. My name is Gareth Dyke, and I'm the Academic Director at ReviewerCredits. Fantastic to have this wonderful opportunity. We're here to talk about best practice in peer review, and I'd like to talk from our perspective at ReviewerCredits, which is all about helping individual peer reviewers to improve their performance and recognition and accreditation as peer reviewers. And we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. But in terms of understanding how journals and publishers manage the peer review process and what best practice is and what best practice should be, I'd like to start by just noting that for most researchers, most peer reviewers, in fact, the peer review process, as you can see here on this slide, is really a very arduous experience. You get to the end of the peer review process as a researcher, as a peer reviewer, and you feel that you've survived the process. Now, both from a researcher's perspective, as well as from the perspective of somebody doing peer review, we are all about making the experience better and helping people to understand how they can use the peer review experience to better enhance their career and develop skills that are transferable within the research ecosystem that can be used in other walks of life. So no matter if you're listening to this as a researcher and you've currently got a paper going through the peer review process, or you are a peer reviewer and you're being asked to do peer review, what does all of this mean? And I'd also like to note that really peer review is not nearly as old as a lot of people think it is. Really, the first paper that was peer reviewed was in the 18th century. Of course, you can see this famous example from the Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the first paper that we know of that was published after peer review. A series of peer-reviewed medical articles were published by the Royal Society of Edinburgh in the 1730s, but most journals, and this is what a lot of people, I think, don't realize, most academic journals didn't really implement the peer review process until much, much later. As you can see here, Nature in the 1960s, Science in the 1940s, it's actually quite a new process in terms of our overall understanding of academic publishing and how long that's been going on for. So lots of papers did get published early in the academic publishing landscape that did not undergo peer review. And I think it's very noteworthy and informative in terms of our understanding of what best practice is and how we can improve upon our best practice in peer review, just to note how young relatively the peer review process is. I mean, 1967, that's almost as old as me, so it's not that old. I'm quite young, as you know. So peer review in the 20th century, our understanding of best practice has to be taken in the context of just how young the process is. 1976, The Lancet, one of the most famous medical journals out there, implemented peer review for the first time. And in terms of best practice, and this is what ReviewerCredits, of course, is all about, choosing and selecting reviewers as journal editors is one of the most important responsibilities that we have. So how's that done? What's best practice in this context? Well, of course, we'd like to have peer reviewers with technical expertise, knowledge of their field, of course, that goes without saying, but we also want peer reviewers who have a fair and constructive attitude. And that's often, as you will be well aware if you're a researcher, often not the case. Part of the reason why researchers feel that peer review is more like a survival obstacle course rather than an enjoyable and effective experience is, of course, because often peer reviewers do not have that fair and constructive attitude. Part of what we're doing at Reviewer Credits is providing training for peer reviewers to help people develop that positive mindset. We also want peer reviewers with no conflicts of interest, good attention to detail, but able to see that bigger picture as well. And they've got to have also, and this I know is something that we'll be talking about in this event, familiarity with journal standards. And that's where the whole view of best practice in peer review comes into its own. We should be providing peer reviewers with guidelines. We should be providing peer reviewers with both industry level best practice as well as journal and publisher level best practice. And that's often not happening. Peer reviewers are often given papers to look at. Their first touch point with the editor would be that email that they get inviting them to peer review. They then do it. And then their second and often only touch point with journal editors is when they send the paper back. And that's an issue where we definitely can improve our best practice, because we are looking for good peer reviewers across these different areas, right? But our editors also have to be able, as they implement best practice, to increase diversity in their reviewer pools, to honor those author exclusions, which researchers are well aware of. If I submit a paper to a journal and I ask that it does not go to certain colleagues, I would hope that those requests are going to be honored. And of course, we need guidelines as editors on how many peer reviewers we should be including. We need to involve as many as possible, but often 3 are enough. And we're all very well aware of that rule of 10 that we've been talking about a lot at Reviewer Credits. You often do need to send 10 emails out as an editor to get your hands on one peer reviewer who agrees to take on the paper. And that's an issue and another area where we would love to see standards in best practice implemented across all publishers and across all journals. And we also, perhaps most importantly of all, as editors, as journal editors, we've got to be alert to that inappropriate reviewer behavior. And I've experienced this both as a researcher being on the receiving end, as well as a journal editor having to deal with the kinds of things that peer reviewers do and peer reviewers try to get away with. So best practice is needed. Guidelines are needed to help us understand and deal with those issues, because at the end of the day, reviewers are being asked to evaluate the study, the research, rather than the specifics of the manuscript. And I think that's an important distinction in our discussion of peer review best practice, because often what we find is that peer reviewers get hung up on the manuscript, and they spend a lot of time talking about, for example, the English. They spend a lot of time correcting often the English and the grammar, and that's not what we're asking them really to assess. We're asking them overall to look fundamentally at the study, the research. Is this research good enough, up to standard enough? Can it be improved for publication in this particular journal, rather than is the English good enough? Because of course that's something that we can go back to the authors and help them improve as editors and as journals. So I would say, in terms of best practice, then what we're asking our peer reviewers to assess would be the objectives of the study, the conclusions of the study, the overall presentation, as well as the references, the findings, and most importantly, perhaps of all, and this is where we do tend to find that peer reviewers focus most of their attention on the methods. So I always say to authors, if you're sending a paper off for peer review, have a look at your methods section fundamentally, because this is where most likely the issues will come in the peer review process. And that's also where I would argue that we would want to focus a lot of our peer review guidelines in order to make sure that our evaluations are following those best practice points. So as a peer reviewer, you're going to need help. You're going to need guidelines and forms and standard templates that you can use when assessing a paper. But the focus should be on the study, the research, rather than on the manuscript, the structure, the language, the grammar, the spelling, and so on. And in particular, focus in terms of best practice when providing peer review guidelines on those sneaky method section, because that, of course, is where most of the nitty-gritty of the study will be focused. And if there's issues in the method section, then there will be wider issues with the study at large. Of course, we can't publish it. It's not going to pass through peer review. And then just in summary, in terms of best practice, I do want to talk a little bit from an editorial perspective about the kinds of peer reviewers that we often encounter, because I see these kinds of peer reviewers all the time, and we need to help people when we pick them up and invite them to participate in the peer review process. We need to make sure that they are thoughtful. Number 3 on my list of 7 dwarfs of peer review, we want reviewers who are going to make thoughtful, in-depth comments about papers, that we want peer reviewers who are following those best practice guidelines that we hope will be implemented as a result of events like this, as a result of weeks like Peer Review Week. Of course, we want constructive remarks that will enable authors to improve their work. But often, as you can see from my examples, we don't get those kinds of peer reviewers at journals. We get people who are cursory. We get people who are aggressive. We get people who are jealous even of authors and feel that perhaps it should be them writing that particular paper. We get people who are angry. I've seen this a lot in my career as a journal editor. You know, if you invite somebody to do peer review and then maybe you end up with enough peer reviewers and you don't need that particular one, they get locked out from the system. They get upset about that. So in terms of our best practice, also as journals and publishers, we need to take care of peer reviewers that we do invite to work on those papers, because that rule, that 1 in 10 rule that we've talked about already, means that if somebody has accepted to take on a peer review task, they expect to be able to complete that peer review task. So these are my dwarfs. We need industry guidelines. We need peer review best practice guidelines to help us with this overall shape of the system, because at the end of the day, it's very, very important for us to consider, and this is a presentation that we often make at ReviewerCredits, people are asking for incentives. Often young researchers in particular are asking for incentives for peer review, and that's not often being provided across the industry. Did you know that about 30% of reviewed article output is actually subject to incentives? Because lots of peer reviewers think, I'm not getting anything back for the work that I'm doing working on this article. Have a look at our most recent blog on the ReviewerCredits website. But those incentives in terms of best practice across the industry are usually limited to publisher offerings and non-cash. However, there are some publishers that pay for peer review. About 15% of article output this year is based on a cash for peer review system. But faster growing publishers, and especially book publishers, invest more in rewards. So what we're looking for at ReviewerCredits, what we're moving towards, I hope, at ReviewerCredits in terms of our contribution to peer review best practice, is a reward system that's based on a reinvestment into the publishing ecosystem and that are applicable cross-publisher, transparent and easy to handle. So what happens if you're listening to this and you'd like to sign up as a peer reviewer on reviewercredits.com, do so, because the participating journals that work with us more and more all the time are awarding credits for the work that you do as a peer reviewer. And then you can get access via our reward center to a range of products and services like publication planning support, editing support, statistical analysis support to help with your results and with your methods, as well as all of the other items that you can see on this side of the slide. So if you are looking for recognition for peer review in terms of best practice across the industry, I would like to encourage you to have a look at the ReviewerCredits site, because what we're finding is that it's time consuming to find peer reviewers. There's a low reviewer acceptance rate and a high rate of reviewer attrition, low engagement generally across the industry with the peer review process, and continuous reviewer delays. We often see at publishers what are very homogeneous reviewer pools, and often publishers are uncertain about the authenticity of their peer reviewers. So all of these aspects in terms of best practice need to be addressed and need to be looked at. So how do you deal with those unhappy reviewers? 88% ask for greater recognition, 84% ask for at least some career incentives, and 87% of reviewers are asking for more training. So my final message in this presentation today, in terms of what we can do to enhance peer review best practice across the industry, would be to take account of these quite striking sets of numbers. How can we develop peer review platforms and systems that provide greater recognition? How can we provide peer review platforms, systems, and best practice that provide career incentives for researchers? And how can we provide peer review platforms and incentives that provide peer review training? So this is the goal. This is the raison d'etre of ReviewerCredits. My name's Gareth Dyke. I thank you very much for listening to this presentation today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thank you to the team at scientifyRESEARCH for the invitation. Great to be here and partner up with Orchid, of course. If you would like to sign up on ReviewerCredits and you haven't done so, have a look at ReviewerCredits.com. You can sign up in a very, very, very short time, a matter of seconds indeed, if you have an Orchid ID. So that's the best way to sign up. Quick and easy. Do have a look at our site. And thank you once again for your attention and for listening to this presentation today. Have a great rest of the event.
Thank you very much, Gareth. It's hard to believe that was a recording. I felt like Gareth was right here with us. All right. Next, I'd like to invite Shivendra Naidu to share his screen, and welcome Shivendra. Shivendra is the Senior Engagement Lead at Orchid and is focused on growing members and integration adoption by working with vendors, service providers, and publishers who serve the wider research community. Shivendra has over a decade of experience working in the academic publishing and educational technology industries before joining Orchid in March of this year. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shivendra.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to your audience. And thank you to Gareth, even though he isn't able to join us. As you say, it was a great presentation. It felt like he was here. And I think he set us up for a great discussion of Orchid as well. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen in full screen mode. Can you just confirm?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to turn off my video just to help with bandwidth, but I will turn it back on for the Q&A session as well. Great. So thanks again for this opportunity to present on Orchid and how we support other systems such as ReviewerCredits and scientifyRESEARCH and various other systems that actually integrate with Orchid. So for those who don't already know, Orchid stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. We're a global nonprofit actually providing an open infrastructure to actually allow other systems to operate and build tools and services on top of our services that we offer. So ORCID's mission has been to enable transparent and trustworthy connections between researchers, their research activities, their contributions, and the organizations they're affiliated with. And we do that by providing a unique persistent identifier free of charge to individual researchers to actually use wherever and whenever they engage in research and other scholarly activity. And as Gareth mentioned, that could be when they're logging into a system such as ReviewerCredits, or when they are actually filling in forms or populating profiles in these other systems that actually integrate with ORCID. So we actually provide 3 different services. There's the unique ID that I mentioned, which is a 16-digit number that is unique to each researcher that they can register for free on the ORCID website to claim one of those. And alongside that, there's also the ORCID record, which can be thought of as a digital CV or a profile that they can then populate with data regarding their employment, their education, funding that they've received, peer review activity, research outputs, whether that's published outputs, but also other types of works and outputs that they've also created during the course of their research, and other relevant metadata to their research activity. And those 2 services are completely free to researchers, so they can sign up on the website for an ORCID ID and populate their record. But the real benefit is actually the third service that we provide there, the ORCID APIs. And these are actually application programming interfaces. These are tools that allow other systems to talk with the ORCID registry and transfer data back and forth between the ORCID records of the researchers and these other systems that rely on that data. And that can actually save the researchers a lot of time as well, because they can actually authenticate their ORCID ID when they log into these systems, and then actually provide permissions to those systems and to their research administrators at their universities and so forth to actually manage that profile on their behalf and actually populate it with data relevant to their activities. So this is quite a text-heavy slide, so I won't cover it in great detail, but this is some of the highlights I want to pick out here is that ORCID was built from the ground up to earn the broadest possible trust of the communities we serve. So we are a non-profit organization, as I mentioned. ORCID can never be bought. We are actually what's called a 501(c) in US parlance, legal parlance. So that means we are run as a non-profit, and if in the unlikely event we were ever to go out of business, our board would actually be tasked with finding somebody else to run us as a non-profit. So the ORCID IDs and the records and all of the data that researchers contribute to those records are owned by the researchers themselves. They have full control over what they include in their record and how it's used, who has permission to access it. They actually have various different trust levels on their records for each different item of data. So they can actually set what the visibility is, whether everything is public or whether it's restricted to trusted organizations, or whether they have something there that's just private to themselves, where they just want to keep as a record of their activities. We also support the FAIR principles of metadata use, so findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And we are also supporting other various legal frameworks like GDPR and so forth. So everything we do actually puts the researcher at the center of those activities, and we develop tools and services based on what we feel is in the researcher's best interests. And all of these other integrated systems are built around ORCID and actually rely on those ORCID APIs that I mentioned to actually transfer data back and forth from those ORCID records. So you can see here that ORCID has become a central hub of activity where over 5,200 installations of systems at member organizations are actually connected and rely on integrating with ORCID to actually read from and write to ORCID records. So you have on the left there a few examples of notable platforms, starting on the research funding side, from looking for funding and actually submitting funding proposals and managing awards and grants. all the way through to the publication side in terms of systems that researchers might interact with when submitting a manuscript to a journal, or actually acting as a peer reviewer or a grant reviewer on those submissions as well. And on the right of the screen, just a few high-level stats that give you an idea of how central ORCID has become to actually facilitating those systems. So you can see that in 2022, ORCID helped researchers 59.9 million times to actually log into a system as a single sign-on option there. One of the founding purposes of ORCID was actually to help tackle the name disambiguation problem, allowing researchers with the same name to correctly identify themselves and be associated with their contributions and research activities. So we have a few examples here on this slide of an article where we have authors with the exact same first name and surname who are actually working on the same study and have published this article together. And the ID allows them to actually differentiate between each other and be correctly identified with their activities and their contributions. Another example above that of an article with a considerable number of authors who have the same surname and first or second initial as well. So there's also a growing trend in publication of hyper-authorship, where articles are now being published with more than 1,000 authors in some cases, arising from massive international research projects across multiple countries and organizations. And again, the ORCID ID can help researchers to actually differentiate themselves from their peers and actually be correctly linked with their contributions and their activities and outputs. Related to this problem, the same author may also publish articles under different variations of their own name, depending on journals' formatting preferences, differing translations of their name, if they've published before and after marriage and have changed their name, and so on. So ORCID also helps to solve this by allowing researchers to record on their ORCID profile variations of their name that they may have published under and correctly link those published outputs to their record as well. Here is an example record from our fictional researcher, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, who you can actually look on the ORCID registry. You can actually look up this record to see an example of a mock-up of a researcher's profile and the various different data that can be contributed to that and sections that can be populated in the record as well. So again, you can see, excuse me, the various name variations there that could be recorded there, and then also the sources of this data that have been contributed to her profile. Information in ORCID records can help save time and effort, as I mentioned. So actually the logging into other systems and actually populating profiles and forms and other things in those systems as well. So researchers and organizations can add all of this information, affiliations, whether that's employment, education, professional activities, funding information, works, publications, other outputs, and website URLs. So that could be their faculty profile on their university website or their LinkedIn profile and so on. But only organizations can actually add research resources and peer review service. So again, this is critical to actually encouraging publishers to actually credit peer reviewers with the activity that they've been providing and the services they've been providing through that peer review activity. So research resources are time awarded on resources such as telescopes, electron microscopes, supercomputers, things like that. So that actually requires the university or the institution that the researcher is affiliated with to be actually providing that data to their record. And we require publishers to actually push the peer review data to a researcher's record as well. ORCID member organizations add validated information. So when a trusted organization such as a university or a publisher writes data to a researcher's record, once they've been granted permission to do so by the researcher, We also include these additional trust markers, these green ticks, to demonstrate that this is validated information written by a trusted source. So I could claim to be a member of faculty at the University of Oxford, but if the University of Oxford is also writing that affiliation to my record, that provides greater reassurance that I am who I am claiming to be. Similarly, when a publisher or a funder asserts review activity to a researcher's ORCID record, that's written to their record with this same trust marker as well. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go through this in great detail, but what I want to say is that we try to aim to balance researcher control with data quality. So often we get asked why certain profiles may not be fully populated. And again, this is down to researchers having full control over what they actually display in their profile and how they share that data on their records. But we do encourage researchers to populate their records with as much information as possible that would be useful to them and to their institutions and the other systems that would actually make use of that data, and also to log in and delegate permissions to their institutions in some cases, who can actually contribute data and manage their profile on their behalf. And other systems that they may also rely on as well that could actually push publications and funding data and so on to their record as well. The next few slides talk about the benefits of ORCID to reviewers, funders, and publishers. So again, I will pick out some of the high-level takeaways from these. On this slide, I'll just reiterate that researchers own their ORCID and their data, and the data they share on their ORCID record, and they can use this to reduce admin burden when logging in and interacting with other systems, and also asserting their identity and in terms of the name disambiguation and so on. In terms of funders, ORCID data can ensure correct and trustworthy award attribution, but also tying this back to peer review, funders can also use the peer review section of the ORCID record to also credit grant review activity carried out by researchers. And once again, contributing this data to ORCID records helps the funder and other funders to make more informed decisions when selecting reviewers based on previous experience. And also critically, it can help to identify and avoid conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment when selecting reviewers. Similarly, when it comes to publishers and ORCID integrated manuscript submission systems, the data pulled in from ORCID records with the owner's permission can help to establish the credibility of the author or reviewer at the time of the article submission or reviewer selection, and also allows the publisher to write their data to their records to credit them with a successful publication or the peer review activity that they've carried out for a particular journal or organization as well. So if I can summarize why researchers should consider registering for an ORCID ID and populating their record as well, it's to connect you with your research activities, outputs, and affiliations, to help you disambiguate yourself from other researchers with the same name. It can help you save yourself time and effort when logging into systems that integrate with ORCID and populating profiles and forms in those systems, or also when permitting trusted organizations to add or update data on your profile on your behalf. It can also help administrators and reviewers verify your identity, experience, and affiliations, which is obviously important when applying for funding or when submitting an article for publication. And lastly, ORCID will always be free for researchers and open to the global research community. Okay, so that was my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Hopefully I picked up on Gareth's presentation enough, but if we need to tie it more specifically to some of the points you mentioned, I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That was a very informative presentation about the importance of ORCID. And I should mention, actually, on the scientifyRESEARCH website, we've also we have the login option to log in with an ORCID ID. And as you said, it's important to remove that login burden and make things easier for researchers. So now at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions questions for Judy, questions for Shivendra. I know there are a few questions in the chat that we can address. So maybe we could start there, but I also see some hands raised as well. So let's start with the hands that are raised, and then we'll come back to the questions in the chat. Merle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment about Orchid, and maybe someone at Orchid can verify this. I think we were one of the first institutions to subscribe to Orchid. And just to give a heads up, some of the places we use, we have Michigan research experts that have people's Orchid in there. And also it is required for all of our graduate students to have the Orchid on their dissertation. So we are really a promoter of Orchid and think it does a great job for the researchers to get all the credit they deserve for all the work that they do. That's all my marketing comment. Thank you.
Thanks for that great comment, Mel. Could you confirm what was your institution, sorry?
University of Michigan.
University of Michigan, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go back to the first question in the chat from Anita. And maybe Judy, you can address this question. So I must say I often have a problem with how demanding should I be with peer reviewing, depending on the impact factor, of course, for the journals, ones that are very demanding and then others that are lower impact. It's an honest question. So Judy, what would you say?
Yes, so maybe I can explain my reference point first. I worked in my first publishing position. I was at Wiley, and for there I was working on an immunology journal and a biotechnology journal. And I was very much involved with the peer review process. Now, this question, we get that quite a lot from authors, from reviewers asking us, you know, what I would say is actually to follow the reviewer guidelines. So usually, at least in all the journals I have worked for, you were always given a set of guidelines, so a set of questions that asks you about the paper. And just answer those questions closest to the paper itself, because you know, sometimes when you make an assessment on how demanding, it could be a value judgment that it may be that over-interpreting of what the editors are actually looking for. So yeah, I would just recommend to follow those guidelines. And I think that's exactly what the editors are looking for, kind of like what Gareth was saying. So it's not so much about, you know, like the language, but really the main points of the paper. Does it actually convey the message? What they claim, is it true? And yeah, follow those guidelines would be the best.
Thank you, Judy. All right. Let's see. I see another hand raised. Inez?
Yes, Inez, thank you very much. I thank you for this, for this very great webinar, as I'm doing the peer review as well, so it was some valuable things. However, I wanted to comment or a little bit disagree on the language side, because there has been sometimes such papers where you are just reading and you just cannot read because the language is like the sentences are so confusing. Like in one sentence, they are saying that something inhibits something, and in the next sentence, they are saying like, oh, this activates the same thing, and so on. So, I mean, I'm trying not to do the language thing, but sometimes the papers that are coming for the review are, and it's just not enough is my comment that English must be improved. I sometimes like to just point out why it should be improved, because it's like, it's hard to understand.
I definitely understand. I can relate to your point, Ines. So thank you for raising that. I think, you know, in terms of best practice for most publishers, when you notice papers, ideally, say you as a reviewer shouldn't have a paper that the language is so bad that you can't even understand what the science is about. That's the best case scenario. But if you do receive papers and you say, okay, I can't understand the English, then I would really recommend to just tell the editors, like, look, like this is going to waste your time to review because you can't even understand the science. And then it's their job to then return to the authors and seek support for their language before they try to submit again.
May I add and ask, because I do not know this thing, and you know, maybe it's better, like, is it just only the reviewer, or after the review process, this manuscript goes through some other editor who will gonna look at the scientific language style and such things? Or is it like, should I care about it, or should I just leave it and hope that somebody else will gonna do, and I will just gonna focus on the science?
When it comes to language editing, you know, your time is very precious, and I don't think any publisher is asking reviewers to also, you know, check do the language editing. It really depends on the publisher. Some publishers are very meticulous when it comes to language polishing the work after it has been accepted for publishing. Yeah, the workflow after that really depends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see a comment in the chat from Maria as well, who I know knows a great deal about peer review as well. Maria, do you want to make a comment? Let's see. No.
So, yeah, I heavily relate to the language kind of hindering what it is that we're trying to assess. But hopefully, for most publishers, language editing would be done prior to peer review. So most of the things that you would find annoying, like consistency in units, for instance, that would have been done prior to peer review so that you can actually focus on the design of the study. However, that may be something that smaller publishers really don't have the budget to do. So, and they want to get their papers out for review as quickly as possible. So I think that that's something that you should address with whoever is asking you to review a paper, whatever editor.
I'm sorry, but can I request, well, I'm receiving the manuscript and I see that it's not like done, and it really irritates me a little bit. Can I send it back to the editor and ask them to do this like normal editing and then send it to me for the review? Or usually it's not, I know that it's not the practice, but actually, can I do that? Can I ask it to be represented to me in a like a representative form?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. At least, you know, from best practice, from what I know, yes.
I think that you can, because people are usually asking you to give up your time and to volunteer your effort. So they might as well, you know, make work easy for you. So yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Let's return to two questions for Shivendra in the chat. Questions about ORCID. So there's a question here from Stephanie that says, are there any safeguards in place to stop unverified or false ORCID profiles from being created and linked to author reviewer profiles? Would you like to address that?
Sure. So thank you for that question, Stephanie. The process is the actual authentication. That is what allows a researcher to give permission to the system to actually write to their record, to their ORCID record. So as I said, because we're an open system and because any researcher can sign up for an ORCID ID, there are cases where some may maliciously create a profile and actually claim or self-assert a particular affiliation or achievement or activity. But the real validated data where you see that trust marker, that tick, where it's been pushed by a peer review, a publisher, or actually engaging in peer review and crediting them for the peer review activity, that can only be done if they're using the authentication process, which actually involves the researcher logging into their system with their ORCID ID. And it's during that login process that they give permission to the publisher to write data to their ORCID record. And they also need to be a member organization, an ORCID member organization, to actually make use of the member API, which allows them to write to records. That's there's the trust factor on the side of the researcher by logging in and authenticating, and the trust factor on the side of the organization by also using the member API and demonstrating that they're a trustworthy organization when they're writing to a record as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah. There's another question here, Shivendra, from Gabriel. Why is it that some ORCID IDs include alphabets, and if you input it into certain websites, it will give a response of invalid ORCID ID?
I was just typing a response to Gabriel there, so I was going to ask him if he wouldn't mind emailing me an example. So the ORCID ID of researchers should always just be a 16-digit number. We don't offer ORCID IDs that actually have alphanumeric characters or anything else like that. But if he has an example, we can actually look into that, and I can provide an explanation as well. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for addressing that. And then there are a few questions here in the chat about funding opportunities, which we would encourage anyone who's looking for research funding to use the research funding database that we have at scientifyRESEARCH. I can follow up with George, with you and Aisha separately about the specific funding opportunities that you're looking for beginners, early career at universities, and then for researchers in Pakistan. So I'll write to you separately. Yeah, are there any other questions?
I think there was other peer review related questions.
On this one.
I think it's still Anita. Delays, yes, the time for delays. I love this question, so I really want to address it. So usually, as Anita says here, you're given like 2 weeks usually, or 10 days, or some even 7 days to do your review reports. And then you have to wait for months to get your review reports back when you're the author. Why is that? Now think about the whole process, right? So you submit your paper, an editor has to look at it, so there's time there. The editor has to then invite those, the rule of thumb was 1 of 10, like 10%, right? Was it what Gareth said? 1 out of 10 will say yes. So imagine when you are emailing these 10 people, you have to first find those people. So there's a lot of time in that. And then you have to email them. You have to get them to respond to that email. You have to get them to say yes. And then you give them 2 weeks. And you know what happens, right? When people give you 2 weeks and then you forget. And so it becomes 3 weeks, right? And so all this then adds up. And so basically, I guess it's a cumulative effect of delays that's causing this, the difference that you see as an author. I love to solve that problem. I think this is actually one of the biggest bottlenecks of scientific progress, because all these papers are just sitting there like a traffic jam. It's terrible. If I had a good idea, I think that could be my next business idea. Right, Kate?
Yeah, thank you, Judy. All right. Well, I've dropped a link in the chat to our funding database, and I see there are some people asking me about funding opportunities in LMIC countries. We actually have an open source list of funding opportunities for researchers in LMICs, which I can. I'm trying to get that link. I could put the link here. I could also send it in the follow-up email. So we will send an email to everybody who registered. We will circulate the slides. We'll compile all of the slide decks from all 3 presenters. And yeah, you're welcome, of course, to email us individually if you have specific questions for any of the speakers today. You have our email addresses here, and we'll also send this to you. Let's see. I think we're at the hour now. I'm sure there are many more questions. I'm also getting questions privately, like direct messages as well. And I'm making note of that, and I'll follow up with each of you individually. Yeah. Well, thank you, Judy. Thank you, Shivendra. Thank you, Gareth. Whichever airplane you're on right now. Yeah, it's amazing that we can all be here together online. I live in Brazil. Judy's in Sweden. Shivendra's in the UK, and Gareth is somewhere in the sky, so flying around. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate that you were here with us today. Please do reach out to us with any additional questions that you have. We'll be happy to answer them. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.